The Isle of Arran, August 1972. With the Polytechnic year ending and having a 2-week break before resuming my work with Southern Electricity, I signed up as a volunteer leader with Forest School camps. Originally an interwar boarding school which lost its premises in the Second World War, it became a charity organising an outdoor camping experience for children aged 6 to 17. The original Forest School drew its philosophy from the woodcraft movement, Native Americans and the Quakers. Special importance was attached to the experience of boys and girls, children and adults, learning to work and play together close to nature. This philosophy was carried through to the post-war FSC. So it was that I took the London train and then the ferry crossing over to the Isle of Arran in the Western Isles of Scotland. And this was where Jan and I first met. During the first evening, I walked over to the Pathfinder group, which was sitting round a campfire. Jan was also there, and we both played our guitars and sang. A few days later, we went for a walk together along the beach. There we sat on swings and talked into the early hours before returning along the cliff path. I was a leader in the Woodlings group along with Martin and Fran. We spent a few days on Holy Island, cooking cockles and mussels on an open fire and sleeping in the open. Back at the campsite, I managed to cut my thumb open with an axe. It was fixed very nicely at the Island Community Hospital. At the end of the fortnight, Jan and I stayed behind to clear up camp and to explore more of the island. We returned to England via Glasgow, where we saw the young Winston, and then slept the night on Preston Station. That was until we were woken by 2 detectives who were looking for runaways. Jan left the train at Wigan and I continued on to St Pancras. As I sat by the ticket gate playing my guitar, a Caribbean porter came over and played some blues songs that he knew. Maidenhead. Next stop for me was Southern Electricity's head office in Maidenhead for the next 3 months, where I found a bedsit situated in a converted stable. I made friends with Mick Beckett, who had the neighbouring stable. The following weekend, Jan and I met at Kettering Station. I was wearing the much too large double-breasted suit that my grandfather had given to me. Apparently Jan, having seen me from the carriage, nearly stayed on the train. Another weekend we met up in London to see the musical Jesus Christ Superstar. Mick Beckett, who was working in a garage, found me a red minicar for £90. So now Jan and I were better able to meet each other in Maidenhead and Bromsgrove, where Jan was a student at Teacher Training College. In October, Jan drove Mick and I to Hebden Bridge, where we set off along the Pennine Way. 4 days later we arrived in Hawes, and I rang Jan. In the local shop the owner surprisingly asked me how Jan was. It transpired that the local telephone exchange operator had been helping the locals to piece together a picture of these two strangers in their midst. Jan came to stay at Maidenhead just before Christmas. After a visit to Whipsnade Zoo, we visited Kettering and then Billinge, where I asked Jan to marry me. In early January 1973, I moved to digs in Tooting Bec, and from there commuted each day to Millbank, where I spent an extremely boring 3 months with the Electricity Council. After many long days of updating annual reports by going through hundreds of pages and adding 1 year to each date that I came across, I decided that a change of career was in order. I was passed as being of officer material by the RAF after a few days of assessment at Biggin Hill, but was not eligible for aircrew on account of my short-sightedness. I then visited an RAF station to find out about the RAF regiment, but soon my thoughts were turning towards teaching. Having visited several ESN schools in the Portsmouth area, Jan and I travelled to Matlock College, which specialises in the training of teachers for ESN work. They offered me a place. However, Jan was unable to obtain employment as a teacher in that area. After Easter it was back to Polytechnic for the final year. Tony Day and I took over a flat in Nettlecombe Avenue, Southsea, which was being vacated by our Scottish law lecturer, who had previously demonstrated her dislike of me by marching up to me after the first year examinations to blurt out with glee, "Mason, you've failed!" She was quite shocked to discover that I was not Mason, and when she did find Whiteman on her list, she discovered to her obvious dismay that I had obtained a very respectable 70% in the examination. However, there is one picture of her above all others that stays in my mind. It was the day in the second year when her wig got caught on the door of the lecture room as she was leaving. It landed on a desk, and her arm appeared through the doorway to hastily retrieve it. On a visit to Kettering, Jan and I were treated to an engagement party, and we organised a special evening service at St Andrew's Church entitled "Presenting Social Injustice." On the 14th of July 1973, Jan and I were married at Upholland Church near Wigan, in a service conducted by my father and grandfather. For this I made the sacrifice of having my hair cut short and my beard removed, whereas Tony Day, best man, wouldn't. Worcestershire. We rented a flat in Barnt Green, near to Lickey Primary School, where Jan had been appointed as a reception teacher. The flat adjoined the home of the marketing director of Cadbury's, and we were only charged £5 a week rent. I began a PGCE course at Worcester College of Education, taking economics as my main subject. It was a difficult probationary year for Jan, as she was subjected to bullying by her supervising teacher, Mrs. Ross. She suffered for most of the year, before finally retaliating, and then Mrs. Ross changed her attitude. The comedy folk group Brownsville Band were coming to a venue in Bromsgrove, so I invited some friends from college to stay over. After college, on the Friday, our convoy of cars, which I was leading, set off from Worcester, and as we were entering Bromsgrove, I suddenly remembered that I had an appointment to give blood there. So without a word of explanation, I led them into the car park, and then on foot, like lambs to the slaughter, they followed me into the building. The blood transfusion service got 6 extra pints that day, but not from Clive, who spun around on his heel when he saw where we were, and was promptly very sick on the pavement outside. "26 Middle Street, Worcester. As winter set in, our landlord called in to inform us that he was selling up. So while I was working at the post office delivering Christmas cards, we searched for new accommodation. Our friend Martin Sparks had recently moved into a shared student house owned by the Oddfellows, and suggested that we rent one of the rooms there. So we joined Martin, Sue, Dave and John. One evening the Oddfellows invited us to one of their open meetings. We sat at a table in the centre of the room, and could hardly contain our laughter when they started the slow hand-clapping as the officials arrived on the platform to give their speeches. Our house was also inhabited by several mice, who would stare at us from the cutlery drawer and eat my lecture notes. So Jan and I captured a local moggy and brought him inside for a day. Unfortunately, it was the same day that our landlord had decided to call on us. But he was very understanding about it and promised to bring us a kitten, which his cat had recently given birth to. The next day, our first cat arrived, and so we called him Adam. Further education. The teaching practice element of the PGCE course took place at Evesham College of Further Education, and I was given a lift in each day by a law lecturer whose mother had taught me piano when we lived in Abington. His father, Frank Smythe, had taken part in 3 Everest expeditions in the 1930s. The team of lecturers at Evesham were very helpful, and I soon found my feet and so enjoyed teaching there. As the summer arrived, I began to search for employment as a further education lecturer. Elizabeth went with me to Lowestoft College, where I only met the principal. The head of business studies had for some mysterious reason been hidden away, who told me that he had 2 more people to interview, that I should ring for a decision the next day. Well, the next day I had an interview at Hinckley, where I was offered that job, From the principal's study I rang Lowestoft and was offered the job there, but decided on Hinckley, because at least I had met my future head of department. August 1974. Grandpa Whiteman and Auntie Gladys marry at Duston Church. Grandpa Bradley had died, and Grandma Bradley, at the front of the group photo, had moved to Lalgate's care home in Northampton.